might all be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness.
All right, so this passage or section of 2 Thessalonians 2 is talking about the son of perdition. And so who is that son of perdition? There's different speculations. I think it's talking about an apostasy. Well, a lot of people say, well, that's the Catholic Church. That was the first great apostasy because it came about in the hundreds. It was actually Judaism and falling away from Christianity, going back into Judaism. And that, because as we're going to talk about on our worship, the sermon, in Revelation chapter 2, the enemy of the churches of Smyrna was the Jews that have left the Christian faith, have left Christianity. They were persecuting Smyrna. But in this context, notice what he says in verse 11. And it says, "For this reason, God will send them strong delusions, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who do not believe the truth, but have pleasure in unrighteousness." Notice the state of this person is, or people, they do not want to believe the truth, but want to have pleasure in righteousness. So that's exactly what Romans chapter 1 is talking about. We want to not recognize God as the authority. We do not want to recognize God as a moral standard. Therefore, we're going to believe a lie. And the lie is that I can do what I want to do. And that's the progression of Romans 1 as you go through. And it states there that God will send them strong delusions. Does that mean that God is the one that's causing them to do it? Think about this. A lot of people say, well, what about Pharaoh? Somebody read Exodus 4, verse 21. Exodus 4, verse 21.
And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand, but I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go.
Okay, so God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Some would say, well, that's not Pharaoh's fault then, that all that happened, because God said he's going to do it. Read chapter 9, verse 12.
And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had spoken unto Moses.
Okay, chapter 10 now, in verse 1.
Now the Lord said to Moses, Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine before him.
Okay, so both of those passages, he stated he was going to harden his heart. You see that he stated that he hardened his heart. And so is it God's fault? Did God say, I'm going to impact his heart and he's going to be hardened to the truth and he's not going to believe it just because I want to prove a point? No. Let's look at Exodus 7 and look at verse 13 and 14.
And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord had said. So the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go.
What did Pharaoh just see in the context here? He watched Aaron do what with the rod? And so after he watched Aaron do what he did with that rod, with God working through him, verse 11 says, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Who hardened his heart here? What Aaron did, right? It's always Aaron's fault. Let's read verse 22 now of the same chapter.
And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them as the Lord had said.
Who hardened his heart here? Who is mentioned? The magicians. Go to chapter 8 now, verse 32. Okay, here we have Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And then the last one is chapter 9 and verse 7. There's more, but these are just a few.
And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead, and the heart of Pharaoh hardened, and he did not let the truth go.
We're not stated who, but we do know that the livestock was deceased or died because of disease, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So you have God hardening Pharaoh's heart. You have Aaron hardening Pharaoh's heart. You have the magicians, his own people. You have the Pharaoh himself. So who's at blame? It's Pharaoh. How did Aaron, let's use Aaron as an example. How did Aaron harden his heart? He didn't. And the thing is what Aaron did harden his heart. See, Pharaoh saw the truth. He didn't want to believe it. And so he says, I'm going to reject that. Okay? He saw his magicians. And later his magicians and his astrologers say, hey, this guy is from God. You need to listen to him. And Pharaoh continued to harden his heart. You have Moses and Aaron standing before him, giving him God's message. He heard the truth, and what did he do? He hardened his heart to it. And so God here did not directly work on his heart and say, I'm going to force him to reject the truth. God is saying, I'm going to allow him because he's a free moral agent. Now, go back to when you think about 2 Thessalonians. The same thing, go back there just real quick in chapter 2. And there's other examples in the scriptures of this. 2 Thessalonians 2, look at verse 9 and 12 again, the last part of 12 actually. End of 11 says, they should believe the lie, that they also may be condemned who do not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. The person that has believed a lie, what are they wanting to do? Yeah. Yeah. And so they have chosen to put the truth on the back burner and continue to believe a lie. Have you ever talked to someone that believed a lie? They really believed what they believed was true. That can happen. That's the hardening of our heart. We can get to the point where we truly believe what we're doing is fine and what we're doing is right. And that is the purpose of, that's a big purpose of the church, is edifying and encouraging one another, and also rebuking one another when we do go into sin, because therefore we don't want to get to the point where we get hardened to sin. And so when we're talking about homosexuality here, we're talking about the things that we see in Romans chapter 1, 20-32. A person that is a part of any of these sins, including homosexuality, could truly believe what they're doing is right. Could truly believe that lie. And so when we try to bring them the truth, they may reject it. And they may tell us that we're wrong, and they may truly believe that they are right in what they're doing. That's the delusion. Yep. Yeah. And it puts in perspective when we sit down to talk to somebody in the world that's never read the Bible, that's never studied the truth. They may have never seen a problem with what they did. You know, we're reading through Acts, and you get to where Paul was recounting the life that he used to live. And he said, I did those things in ignorance. What does he mean by that? He didn't know any better. When he found out the truth, what did he do? He changed. That's not always the case. Somebody may still find out the truth and say, you know what, I don't care. Because we don't want to recognize who God is with any of the sins that are mentioned in Romans 1. And so going back to Romans 1, I want to finish up looking at, it's a verse at the end. Romans chapter 1. And look at verse 32. So starting in verse 28, it says, "And even as they did not retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful." That's a big list. And so it's all of these things. They have found them to be fine. This is the life of living whatever you want to do. Verse 32, "Who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." We have to be careful in our acceptance, because we cannot be accepting of anybody in these states, of these things that are in here. And we should not be encouraging them to live that way, because we will see the same end if we are doing that. And so it is a sin. All of these things are sin. Homosexuality is mentioned right in that, and that's what we're focusing on with this study. And we've got to see that it is punishable in eternal damnation if a person does not change. All right, so we talk about that. I want to move on now to going back to our book. Let's read paragraph 3. If you got your books. Page 10. We've read paragraph 1 and 2, which is kind of introducing this subject like we just did. But now I want to look at paragraph 3. Somebody want to read that?
Homosexuality is not a problem isolated to age. This sin has been around for a long time. Read Genesis 19:1-13. The men of Sodom were horribly wicked. In verse 5, the men of Sodom desired to know Lot's guest. Know, as used in this verse, means to have sexual relations, as in Genesis 4:1. Sodomites were so engrossed in their homosexuality, they were ready to break down Lot's door to give to his guest. If one continues reading Genesis 19, he finds that God utterly destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in their wickedness, verse 24. Other passages in the law of Moses condemn this sin, Leviticus 18:22-13. God does not hate homosexuals. He does hate the sin of homosexuality.
All right, so we're looking at homosexuality has been a problem for forever. We see that with Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis chapter 19. Let's read that, Genesis 19, 1-13. And I know we all know this account, but I want to read it because we're going to talk about some of the things that people believe was actually the problem here. They think is the problem here, and it was not homosexuality. We're going to talk about that in length. Somebody read Genesis 19, 1-13.
And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat at the gate, in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them. And he bowed himself with his face toward them, and he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and you shall rise up early and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned
All right, so Sodom was a very wicked city. Do you think that this sin of homosexuality was the only problem in this city? I highly doubt that. And the reason I believe it's not just that, because you have Romans chapter 1, shows us that what can happen when we give up on God is that chasing anything that fits our fits our desires at that point. But you have here some things that, there's always one thing in this section I don't understand. Why did Lot offer his daughters? I never understood that, and I still don't understand that. But because he did, it does show us what they really were wanting to do. It's a terrible thing to think about, but maybe that information is there just so to answer this. You know, God is wise. God understands what people are going to do. God knew that people are going to try to argue that this is what the sin of this section, what it's about. And maybe that's why it was put there and recorded for us. But it does give us insight into that. And you get down to verse 5, what the men said. It says, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Now my version, which is New King James, says carnally. Now that word carnally was not in, Debbie, it didn't have it in you were the one that read that, wasn't it? It didn't have it. You just said to know. The word carnally here is italicized, which in this version means that it's inputted by the translators. It was not in the original manuscripts. And so some would say, well, then obviously that's not what this word means. Well, we're going to talk about the word know here. The book states it. The word know means to know sexually. And it's used that way throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew word, many times. And we're going to talk about that more in depth in a minute. So the word carnally does not have to be there. It does give us some more insight into the word, but the word does not have to be there to know what is going on. But we see that this city was engrossed in that homosexuality, as just talked about. And so what did God do? Well, God utterly destroyed it. We've seen many other cities and many other groups of people be wicked. We do not see this level of destruction come upon a city. Now, we've seen the whole world be destroyed for what? Wiped clean because of sin. But we have not seen anything besides that in what we see here in any other place. So their wickedness was extremely terrible, to the point where God wanted to wipe them out. Where is Sodom and Gomorrah today? Can't find it. I kind of believe that you have the Salt Sea area. You think about fire and brimstone, there's a lot of sulfur. I think that's the area that Sodom and Gomorrah used to be in, and a lot of people believe that. There is nothing there anymore. It's scorched earth. And so that just shows what God thinks of this sin and what God thinks of wickedness. There's other passages. Somebody read Exodus 18:22, which is a passage that we've read a couple times. Leviticus 18:22. Leviticus, sorry. I noticed that. It is Leviticus. See if you're paying attention. You were. See, because I got my tie clip on. That's right.
Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is an abomination.
Okay, so it was condemned in the law of Moses, chapter 20 and verse 13 now of Leviticus. All right. And so we see it's condemned in the old law, and that's what we're kind of looking at in this paragraph, is looking at what the old law states. But I do want to talk about, and we've already talked about this before, what he stated in the last part of that paragraph. It says, God does not hate homosexuals. When we looked at 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, we looked at how that was the life of the Christians there in 1 Corinthians. And Paul said that was some of you. And one of the sins mentioned there was lesbianism and homosexuality, looking at it from the both ways, or being gay. And so that was sins that they had been a part of. That was their lifestyle in the past, but they weren't anymore. If God hated homosexuals, why would he give them an opportunity to change? Did Christ just die for certain groups of people? No, Christ died for all of us. Sin is sin. And so we do need to realize that. And we also need to realize that when we're interacting with those that are choosing this lifestyle. God loves them, we should too. We should hate the sin of homosexuality, which God does, for sure. And so when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, there are different ideas on what really was going on here. And that's what I want to look at, some arguments against the biblical teaching of homosexuality in the Old Testament. Since we're looking at the Old Testament, we're going to start there. The first idea, and this is someone actually told me this, the sin of Sodom was rape. It was not consensual. And so what God was angry with was the fact that this sin was not consensual, or this act was not consensual between different people. They were wanting to do something like this, terrible. Well, how do we answer that? Let's go to Jude. We haven't read this yet. I've mentioned it several times. Jude 6 and 7. What does Jude say was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Sexual immorality, which is fornication. And that word includes all different, we've talked about that, it includes all different acts. And so it could be fornication, adultery, it could be homosexuality. So it's the sexual sins. And each one of those things. So it can include both. But what gives us the indication of what it means is the word strange flesh there. And when that is used, it's referring to that sin of homosexuality. So Jude states that the sin of Sodom that caused God to destroy them, the end of his patience with them, was the sin of homosexuality. And so Jude plainly states that. He doesn't say anything about rape. He doesn't say anything about anything like that. He stated specifically what the sin of Sodom was. And so this is an answer to that. Honestly, this can answer any of these arguments because you could go here. The next one is a belief that it is inhospitality. It's a crazy one, but it is. This is based on the Canaanite. This is from Geisler page. If you want to go to his book, I can show you his book. It says, this is based on the Canaanite custom that guaranteed the protection of those coming under one's roof. Lot is alleged to have referred to it when he said, don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. And that was in Genesis 19:8. So Lot offered his daughters to satisfy the angry crowd and protect the lives of the visitors who had come under his roof. This sexual appeasement was necessary to save their lives. This is what is believed, the argument. And so the idea is that it is inhospitality. It's because he needed to make sure he just protected his visitors. That was it. Was Lot trying to protect them? Yes. He knew the sin of the city, and he wanted to protect them. But was that the reason why God destroyed Sodom? No. The last answer, definitely, we can go to Jude 6 and 7 again and look at that and see that it's not true. The next thing is the word to know, which we talked about that already. But the word is used. Somebody read Genesis 19:5 again. You're fine. Genesis 19:5. Somebody read that?
And they called unto Lot and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them.
All right, so the word to know. The argument is that the word to know means to get acquainted. It means just to get acquainted with somebody. The word can mean that. It can also mean to get acquainted with somebody. But the problem with that is the word is used 12 times in the Hebrew. 10 out of those 12 times it's used in this way, that Sodom is. And so it means to know sexually, as we see here. Example, somebody read it, Genesis 4 and verse 1.
And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord.
Was he just getting acquainted with his wife there? That's what the word means. Somebody read lose my spot here. Verse 25, sorry. Chapter 4, verse 25.
And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew.
All right, so we could go to several different places and continue to look at this, but just like any other word, a word can mean different things, and you have to look at the context. The context dictates what the word means. I mean, helps us to understand what the word means. If it really meant to be acquainted, why did he offer his daughters? The context tells us that. This is a big one because a lot of people want to go to this and say, well, the sin of Sodom was not that. It was just they were not acquainted. The word to know does not mean what you think it does. And there's a lot of times people try to twist what the Hebrew words say. And one of them is the word day, and believing that the creation was over millions of years, and that the word day really doesn't mean a 24-hour period. The word day is used to mean a 24-hour period in the Hebrew many times.
I mean, it was even the same way with Joseph and Mary.
Yep.
In Matthew 1:25, he said, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son.
That's right. Yep.
That's pretty self-explanatory.
It is. And so you can go to different passages like that and say, hey, this is what it means. And you can obviously see that. But like we said, if somebody that doesn't want to believe the truth, what are they going to do? See what they want to see. What can we do? All we can do is show them the truth. That's one thing I learned in school. All you can do is teach. You can't force anybody to see anything different. You can't force anybody to believe differently. And the reason is, thankfully, because we have our free moral agents. We have our choice. And so we choose what we're going to believe, and we individually face the consequences of our choices. And so that's how it stays. Perry?
Yeah, that's why Jesus said, if the village receives you in my name, stay and tarry, but if they don't, shake the rest of the people.
Move on. That's right. There's a point we got to move on with some people. It happens because you just want to argue what the truth is, and it's stated right there for us. Another belief is that the sin of Sodom was because of selfishness. Somebody read Ezekiel 16:49. Mm-hmm.
Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy.
Okay, so you got the idea here of selfishness, and it is a focus of this, and that selfishness. And so the idea here is they state that no mention is made of homosexuality or related sexual sins. And so what it's talking about is saying Sodom is mentioned, but the sin of Sodom that people want to believe is the sin of Sodom is not mentioned, because that's not what was going on in the case. So therefore, it excludes it. It was just selfishness. They were condemned simply, this is quoting, they were condemned simply because they were selfish, not because they were homosexuals. Well, the answer to that, selfishness that is mentioned does not exclude it. Just because the phrase Sodom is used does not mean that he is specifically talking about that subject. Are sexual sins a form of selfishness? They are. So the implication there, it is included. Somebody read the next verse 50. Ezekiel 16:50.
And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I sought them.
Abomination. So God said their sin was an abomination. Read Leviticus 18:22 again. That same word is used. And so God is saying any sin is an abomination, and including here. So just because, like I said, just because the word Sodom is used in describing the wickedness of a group of people, it does not exclude it and say, well, it's not, the sin of Sodom was not it. The last one, we're about to run out of time. It's believed that homosexuality is associated with idolatry was the sin. And so only when it was associated with idolatry. Somebody read Deuteronomy 23:17.
There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel.
And then 1 Kings 14:24.
And there were also perverted persons in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel.
Okay. The sin of fornication in its entirety was a big part of idolatry worship. The temple of Diana, the different temples in the Roman times and the Greek times, we always talk about it, there was female prostitutes. There was also males, both. And the reason for that is because of what was associated with idol worship. And anytime you see Israel going off the rails and serving idols, that's exactly what they went for, first off. We're going to talk about that and just mention it in passing, but Balaam and Balak, when Balaam was trying to get Balak to, he was trying to curse the Israelites, or Balak was trying to get Balaam to do that, and God kept working through Balaam and not letting him curse the people. He finally said, make them start serving idols, and exactly what they did. And so you see that in the book of Numbers. And so, yes, it is associated with it, but does that mean that it's the only point on when it's wrong? And so somebody read Hosea 3 and verse 1. I'm going past time.
Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods, and love ravens of the line.
And then chapter 4 and verse 12.
My people
Adultery was also a part of idol worship. Does that mean that adultery was fine outside of idol worship? Outside of idol worship? No. We see that in Hosea here, chapter 3 and chapter 4, and the whole book, honestly. And then we'll pick up here next week, but Exodus 20, 14 through 17 in the Ten Commandments, the two were distinguished as two different sins, idolatry and sexual sins. And so just because it's mentioned in places with idol worship does not mean it's not wrong, because we've read other passages where it is wrong. And so, all right, anybody got any questions or comments? We'll be moving on from Sodom and Gomorrah and looking at a couple other places in the Old Testament that people will hold to that saying